Hi everyone, my name is Lucia Henneberg and today I'll be presenting my research on whether competition changes the relative importance of absolute and relative standing and feedback. So this study is based on 3 independent variables. So the first 2 is absolute versus relative feedback. So in this case, we're referring to absolute feedback as, say, a number of correct questions out of a total on an exam. Whereas relative standing would be a test taker's performance with regard to other people's. So then when you bring in the competition element, you are bringing in an element of social comparison. So research shows that in a competition environment, an individual's tendency to compare themselves to others is heightened. So previous research on absolute and relative scoring indicates that absolute scores tend to have a greater impact on an individual's self-concept than relative scores do. So what we're trying to measure in our research is whether when you bring in an element of such heightened social comparison as competition, whether those results would change. And our hypothesis is that in a competition environment, relative scores would actually become more important to the individual than the absolute score does. And so the way we measured it was by gathering 100 undergraduate students in introductory psychology classes at Western Kentucky University, and we separated them into 8 groups. So first they went into either a competition group or a non-competition group. So those individuals in the competition group were told that their scores on a math test would be compared to the other participants' scores, and that those students who scored in the top 10 would be called back for a subsequent study. And then those students who were not in the competition group were, of course, not told this information. So after the competition priming, the students took some ACT math questions. And then after taking those math questions, they received some fictional feedback. So with the fictional feedback, we then separated the students into the absolute and relative scoring groups. So we had a high absolute scoring group, which was 4 out of 6 questions answered correctly, and then a low absolute scoring group, which was 2 out of 6 questions answered correctly, and then a high relative scoring group, which was scoring better than 70% of participants, or a low relative scoring group, which was scoring better than only 30% of participants. So after students received their feedback, they were asked to complete some surveys for our dependent variable measures. So we used the PANAS survey for affect, and then a satisfaction with performance survey, and then we asked the students to predict their performance on a subsequent set of math questions. And then after those surveys were conducted, students took a second set of math questions, then they were of course debriefed, and then we began to analyze our results. So if you'll look at our figures, our first 2 will take a look at the predicted score that students gave. So in the first figure, we'll look at the absolute score prediction. And what we found was that students who scored with a high absolute score as their fictitious feedback would actually predict that they got a high absolute score in a subsequent set of questions. And then this carried over to the low absolute score as well. These results were the same for the relative score. So students who had a high relative score as their fictitious feedback predicted that they would get another high relative score in a subsequent set of questions. And so what these 2 figures show was that our priming for the feedback was actually very effective. So then when we look into the rest of our dependent variables, our third figure shows that the effect on the satisfaction with score that the feedback had and that the competition had. And so what we found was that a absolute score was really the only thing that impacted satisfaction with performance in the students. So students with a high absolute score were more satisfied with their performance than students with a low absolute score. But this did not apply to the relative scoring and did not change across the competition groups. Really, when we start to see our 3-way interaction sort of take hold is in the affect. And this you can see in our last 2 figures. So what we found with the affect was that students in the competition group had an impact on affect based on their absolute score. So students in the competition group with a high absolute score had a lower negative affect than students with a low absolute score, but this was only for the competition group. What you'll see in the last figure is for the non-competition group, we found that students really only place an impact or any value in the relative score when their absolute score was already low. So students with a low absolute score then let the relative score impact their affect more than other students. And this was only true for the non-competition groups. And so what this really reflects is that our research is sort of in accordance with the previous research on absolute and relative scores. So we found that in the big picture of our research, the absolute score really had more influence than the relative score did, regardless of the competition or non-competition groups. So this is, of course, not what we predicted, and so we're hoping in subsequent studies to improve and increase our competition priming so that maybe we can see some more significant results between the two competition groups and see if there actually would be a greater difference if we changed our competition priming. So that's what we're hoping to do once we can get back into the lab and gather some more data. So I want to thank Western Kentucky University and the psychology department, and of course my advisor, Dr. Zhao, for helping me and guiding me through this research. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. My email is Licia, Licia.Henneberg, Henneberg, 488 @topper.wku.edu. And thank you all so much for watching.